The first time Summer Smith tasted starlight, it wasn't through a telescope or a textbook. It was through her grandfather's flask, left carelessly on the kitchen counter during one of his 3 a.m. sandwich raids. She was 8, curious as moonlight, and the liquid inside glowed with the soft blue-green of distant nebulae. One small sip, and suddenly she could taste the memory of worlds where rain fell upward and trees hummed lullabies to sleeping cities. The flavor lingered like a gentle secret on her tongue, sweet with the echo of Rick's wonder, before cynicism learned his address. That night, as she drifted towards sleep, Summer felt the first whisper of something vast and tender calling her, name through the spaces between atoms. But that moment came 3 years after the night everything began, when Rick's return from dimension C394b coincided with Beth's labor in ways that felt less like coincidence and more like the universe finally getting its timing right. The delivery room at St. Equus Hospital had been perfectly ordinary until 11:47 p.m., when the fluorescent lights began humming a melody that nurses would later swear sounded like a lullaby, though none could quite remember how it went. Rick arrived. Through the automatic doors, carrying exhaustion like a coat and cosmic dust like cologne, his lab coat singed with the residue of interdimensional travel, and his eyes holding that particular softness that came from spending 6 months in a reality, where harsh words simply dissolved before they could be spoken. He'd been chasing a lead on entropy that ran backward, on broken things that healed themselves, but the moment he'd received Jerry's frantic voicemail about Beth going into labor, something in his chest, something he'd forgotten he still possessed, had pulled him home with the urgency of gravity. The nurses tried to redirect him, of course, visiting hours, hospital protocol, the usual bureaucratic symphony. But Beth, even in the grip of contractions, had looked at her father with eyes that said she'd been waiting for exactly this kind of impossible timing, this perfect convergence of science and sentiment that only Rick could orchestrate without meaning to. Summer arrived at 11:52 p.m., 5 minutes after Rick's presence seemed to shift something fundamental in the room's atmosphere. The moment she drew her first breath, the humming lights settled into ordinary fluorescence, but the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was expectant, like the pause between lightning and thunder when the whole world holds its breath. Rick approached his newborn granddaughter with the same careful reverence he usually reserved for handling unstable quantum materials. His hands, steady enough to perform surgery on the fabric of reality itself, trembled slightly as he looked down at Summer's face. She didn't cry the way babies were supposed to cry. Instead, she opened her eyes, impossibly alert for someone who'd been breathing for less than 3 minutes, and seemed to study Rick's face with the intensity of a scientist, encountering a particularly fascinating specimen. That quote S, when the portal whispered itself open. It was small, no bigger than a dinner plate, hovering just above Summer's bassinet. Like a window into elsewhere. Through it, Rick could see the dimension he'd just left, C394b, where Aurora painted lullabies across the sky every night, and the very air tasted of contentment. The portal pulsed gently, synchronized with Summer's breathing, and through it drifted the faintest sound of wind chimes made from crystallized starlight, and the distant echo of mothers singing children to sleep across light years of space. Summer, quote, S. Tiny hand reached toward the portal, not with the random flailing of a newborn, but with purpose, as if she recognized something familiar in that glimpse of otherwhere. Rick watched, transfixed, as cosmic dust from C394b settled on his granddaughter's fingers like fairy tale glitter, each mote carrying the memory of worlds where kindness was the fundamental force and love was as measurable as gravity. The portal closed after 37 seconds. Rick timed it because timing impossible things was how he made sense of wonder, but its effects lingered. Summer seemed to listen to something the rest of them couldn't hear, her eyes tracking movements in the air above her head, as if she could see the invisible threads connecting all things across all dimensions. Rick whispered to his granddaughter that night about places where wonder wasn't a luxury, but a way of life, where intelligence served kindness instead of the other way around. Summer listened with the attention of someone much older, someone who understood that the universe's greatest secrets weren't hidden in equations, but whispered in quiet moments, when love and science discovered they'd been speaking the same language. All along, in the months that followed the night of gentle portals, Summer grew into her sensitivity the way flowers grow toward light, naturally, inevitably, with a grace that seemed to understand something the rest of the world had forgotten. By her second birthday, she had developed what Beth called the listening look, a particular expression of focused attention that would cross her face whenever the house settled into one of its quiet moments. She would pause mid-crawl, her small head tilted as if hearing music played just below the threshold of normal perception. Rick noticed, because Rick noticed everything, but he noticed this with the particular fascination he reserved for phenomena that shouldn't exist according to any scientific model he understood. Summer would navigate the house with purposeful determination, not toward the bright chaos of her toy box or the cheerful noise of the television, but toward the spaces where gentleness pooled like morning light. The corner, where Beth's humming lingered after she'd moved to another room. The spot by the kitchen window where the coffee maker's final gurgle held the promise of peaceful mornings. By her third birthday, Summer had begun collecting these moments with the methodical precision of a researcher gathering rare specimens. She would cup her hands to catch the last drops of morning dew before the sun claimed them, holding each droplet up to the light as if she could see the dreams it had absorbed during the night. She pressed flower petals between the pages of Jerry's abandoned self-help books, not for their color or shape, but for the memory they carried of their brief, perfect bloom. She gathered smooth pebbles from the backyard, each one worn soft by countless gentle rains, and arranged them on her windowsill in patterns that seemed to follow some internal logic of tranquility. Rick discovered her collection on a Tuesday afternoon when Beth had asked him to check on Summer during her supposed nap. Instead of sleeping, his granddaughter sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, surrounded by small containers, mason jars, old mint tins, even a repurposed baby food jar. Each one carefully labeled in her developing handwriting with words like, "The sound Mummy makes when she thinks I'm sleeping," and the click when Grandpa Rick closes the garage door but he's not mad. Rick lowered himself to the carpet, his knees protesting the unaccustomed position, and watched Summer arrange her treasures with the reverence of someone who understood that gentle things required gentle handling. When he opened one of the jars, labeled, "Beth's laugh from when I said grandfather instead of grandpa," he caught the faintest echo of that morning's joy, somehow preserved in the space between sound and silence. "What are you doing, Summer?" he asked. His voice softer than he'd intended. Summer looked up with eyes that seemed far too knowing for someone who still needed help reaching light switches. "Keeping the good parts," she said simply, as if the preservation of tenderness was the most natural scientific endeavor in the world. That night, after Summer had fallen asleep, clutching a jar labeled "The Space Between Lightning and Thunder," when everything is waiting, Rick worked in his garage until dawn. He crafted something no bigger than a pocket watch, a device that could capture and preserve not just sound or image, but the emotional resonance of moments, their particular flavor of contentment, their weight of wonder. When Summer found it on her breakfast table the next morning, along with a note that read, "For a fellow scientist of gentle things," she understood immediately. The device hummed warmly in her small hands, its soft light pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat, ready to help her preserve the quiet symphony of a world that spoke in whispers to those who knew how to listen. The device Rick had crafted became Summer's gentle companion in the weeks that followed, its warm pulse teaching her to notice the house's quieter rhythms with newfound precision. She learned to read the emotional weather of each room, capturing not just the sound of Beth's humming, but the particular contentment it carried when dinner had gone well and everyone felt fed in more ways than one. The device helped her understand that Rick too had his own patterns of peace, though they emerged in the deepest hours when the world had settled into sleep. Summer discovered Rick's midnight sanctuary quite by accident, drawn downstairs by the soft amber glow seeping from beneath the kitchen door at 3 a.m. Through the crack, she watched her grandfather move with surprising tenderness, his usual manic energy replaced by something approaching meditation. Rick stood at the counter in his lab coat, constructing what could only be described as an architectural marvel disguised as a late-night snack. His hands, steady enough to calibrate interdimensional weaponry, moved with reverent precision as he layered turkey and Swiss cheese with the same attention he gave to complex equations. He spread mustard in careful, even strokes, arranged lettuce leaves like delicate circuitry, and pressed the bread together with the gentleness of someone handling something precious. The kitchen's quiet light transformed Rick into someone smaller, more human-sized, surrounded by the humble tools of nourishment rather than the chaos of cosmic adventure. Summer held her breath, afraid to interrupt what felt like a sacred ritual. But Rick's peripheral awareness, honed by decades of interdimensional survival, caught her small silhouette almost immediately. "Can't sleep either, kiddo?" he asked without turning, his voice carrying none of its usual defensive edge. In this amber-lit sanctuary, Rick seemed to have shed his armor of cynicism, along with his usual urgency. Summer stepped into the kitchen's warm circle of light, her bare feet silent on the cool tiles. "The quiet gets too loud sometimes," she said, a phrase that made perfect sense to both of them. Rick turned then, studying his granddaughter with the same careful attention he'd given to his sandwich construction. "Want to learn about the quantum mechanics of midnight comfort food?" he asked, and Summer heard the real invitation beneath the scientific language, not just to stay, but to belong in this peaceful space he'd carved from his usual chaos. She climbed onto the kitchen stool, legs swinging as Rick began to explain the theoretical physics of late-night nourishment, how the right balance of protein and carbohydrate could stabilize neurotransmitters, how the act of creation, even something as simple as assembling ingredients, activated the same neural pathways as solving complex problems. But as he talked, Summer noticed Rick's explanations growing softer, more wandering, less about science and more about the simple pleasure of making something good with careful hands. "The real secret," Rick said, cutting his masterpiece with surgical precision, "here's understanding that some things don't need to be complicated to be profound." He handed Summer a perfect triangular half, still warm from the careful toasting. "Why triangles?" Summer asked, examining the geometric perfection of her portion. Rick considered this with the seriousness he gave to all of Summer's questions. "Triangles are the strongest shape in structural engineering," he said slowly, "but they're also approachable. Circles are too perfect, squares too rigid. Triangles have personality. They invite you to start at the point and work your way into the experience." Summer nodded as if this made complete cosmic sense, which, in the logic of midnight kitchens and grandfather-granddaughter conspiracies, it absolutely did. She pulled out her device and let it capture not the visual or auditory elements of the moment, but its emotional temperature, the feeling of being trusted with Rick's gentleness, the warmth of inclusion in his private ritual, of peace. They ate in comfortable silence, the kitchen wrapped around them like a cocoon of shared solitude. Summer tasted not just turkey and mustard, but the meditation Rick had layered between each ingredient, the careful attention he'd given to creating something nourishing rather than merely functional. From that night forward, the midnight sandwich became their unspoken tradition, a regular appointment with tenderness that neither acknowledged directly but both protected fiercely. In these kitchen conversations, Summer learned that Rick's cynicism was simply another kind of protective device, and beneath it lived someone who understood that the universe's most important discoveries happened not in laboratories, but in the gentle space between two people who had learned to be quiet together. Their midnight sandwich rituals naturally expanded beyond the kitchen's amber sanctuary, flowing like a gentle current into the mysterious ecosystem of Rick's garage. Summer, now approaching her 6th birthday, with the particular wisdom that comes from being genuinely seen and understood, began to recognize that the garage held its own language, one written in light and hummed in frequencies that spoke directly to her developing sensitivity to the world's quieter communications. The garage had always pulsed with its own mysterious heartbeat, but Summer learned to read its moods the way other children learned to read facial expressions. Each piece of Rick's interdimensional technology sang its own subtle song, and Summer discovered she could predict her grandfather's emotional weather by observing the colors that danced across his various inventions like aurora painting stories. Across a mechanical sky. Blue light meant hope taking physical form. When Rick's devices glowed with the sharp electric blue of distant stars, Summer knew he was building something new, something that hummed with possibility rather than necessity. These were his architect days, when his hands moved with the precision of someone constructing bridges between what was and what could be. During blue light sessions, Summer would approach carefully, bringing him glasses of cool water that he'd accept with absent-minded gratitude. His consciousness split between dimensions of pure creative mathematics. Red light carried the urgency of things gone wrong, casting everything in the garage in shades of warning and frustration. Red meant Rick was trying to repair not just broken circuits, but broken pieces of himself. Shattered theories, painful memories, the infinite cascade of consequences that followed him through every dimension. On red light days, his hands moved with desperate precision, and Summer learned to stay close but quiet, her presence a gentle anchor, reminding him he wasn't alone with his mistakes. Yellow light was Summer's favorite, warm and persistent like honey made from captured sunshine. When the garage glowed yellow, it meant Rick wasn't building for crisis or fixing out of desperation. He was creating for the pure joy of creation, tinkering with ideas simply because they delighted him. Yellow light meant Rick was playing, disguising wonder as science, and allowing himself the luxury of curiosity without consequence. On one particularly golden afternoon, when the garage felt more like a cathedral of gentle invention than a workshop, Summer found Rick crafting something that resembled a cross between a music box and a telescope. Its brass surfaces caught the light like captured starshine, and when Summer asked what he was building, Rick looked up with the unguarded enthusiasm that only appeared during yellow light days. "Something completely unnecessary," he said with satisfaction that bordered on pride. "A machine that can show you what clouds dream about when they're not busy being weather." Summer began keeping a small notebook, documenting the garage's emotional weather with the methodical care of a scientist, studying a beloved phenomenon. She drew little boxes of color, noted the pitch of various hums, recorded the scent in the room, ozone, hot dust, the citrus of fresh solder flux, and wrote single sentences about the feelings underneath each combination. More importantly, she developed her own ritual of response. On yellow light evenings, when the hum was gentle and the air felt softer, Summer would brew Rick's favorite black tea, sweetening it with a single drop of honey. She would carry it carefully to the garage, knock softly, and leave it on the concrete. Step, a small offering of quiet understanding. She never waited for acknowledgement, never asked for thanks. The tea was simply her way of saying she recognized his peace and wanted to honor it. One evening, as yellow light pulsed steadily beneath the door, and a particularly intricate mechanical melody filled the night, Summer placed the tea on its usual spot. As she turned to leave, the door creaked open, just a crack. Rick's hand, smudged, with grease and glowing faintly from the yellow light within, reached out and gently took the mug. He didn't speak, didn't even look at her directly. But as the door clicked shut, Summer felt a warmth spread through her chest. The quiet understanding that in the silent language of garage lights and midnight tea, she had found another way to connect with the vast, tender heart hidden beneath. Her grandfather's armor of cynicism, the garage had become their second sanctuary. A place where love spoke in colors and understanding hummed in frequencies only they could hear. The understanding that had grown between them in the language of garage lights and midnight tea reached its natural conclusion on a morning when the yellow glow beneath Rick's workshop door had been steady for 3 consecutive days, a record that suggested something more than temporary contentment. Summer found him there as the sun painted the kitchen windows gold, hunched over a workbench scattered with components that hummed with the same gentle frequency as her emotion-capturing device. "I've been thinking," Rick said without looking up, his voice carrying none of its usual defensive edges, "about training wheels, about the difference between showing someone the universe and letting them discover it." His hands moved with the careful precision Summer had learned to associate with his most thoughtful creations, assembling something that looked like a compass made from crystallized moonlight. The device he placed in her palm was warm, no bigger than a pocket watch, its surface shifting between silver and pearl like captured starshine. Unlike Rick's usual portal gun with its harsh electric urgency, this one pulsed gently, synchronizing with Summer's heartbeat as if it had been calibrated specifically for her particular rhythm of wonder. One destination, Rick explained, his scientist's need for precision softened by something approaching tenderness. Dimension C394, be gentle. No monsters, no crises, no universe-ending catastrophes, just a place where wonder doesn't come with consequences. He paused, studying Summer's face with the careful attention he usually reserved for complex equations. Think of it as a vacation from chaos. Summer held the device with the reverence she'd learned to give all precious things, feeling its warm pulse echo through her fingers like a lullaby made tangible. When she activated it with the gentlest touch, the portal that bloomed before them opened like a flower made of soft light, its edges watercolor gentle, revealing a world that seemed designed by someone who understood that beauty didn't need to be dramatic, to be profound. They stepped through together, Rick's usual manic energy replaced by something approaching meditation, into a dimension where the air itself tasted of contentment. The ground beneath their feet felt like velvet, covered in grass that sang quiet harmonies when the breeze passed through it. Above them, clouds drifted low enough to touch, their surfaces glowing with the warm light of perpetual golden hour, casting everything in the gentle amber of late afternoon dreams. Summer watched Rick's shoulders settle as the dimension's peaceful atmosphere wrapped around him like a familiar blanket. Here, without crisis to manage or universe-ending threats to outthink, her grandfather became someone smaller, more human-sized, someone who could appreciate the simple pleasure of grass that felt good beneath your feet and air that carried the faint sweetness of vanilla and distant flowers. They walked without destination, their footsteps muffled by the velvet ground, past trees that grew in gentle spirals designed for climbing and contemplation. Rick pointed out crystalline formations that chimed like wind bells when touched by the breeze, his explanations free from the usual urgency of scientific discovery, offered instead with the quiet joy of someone sharing a beloved secret. When they settled beneath a tree whose branches formed natural seats, Rick unpacked sandwiches, constructed with the same careful attention he gave to his midnight creations. As they ate, Summer used her device to capture not the visual wonder of singing grass or chiming crystals, but the feeling of being in a place where Rick felt safe enough to rest, where his brilliant mind could simply enjoy rather than constantly calculate survival strategies. The dimension offered no grand revelations or cosmic insights, just the profound gift of existing in a space where wonder was allowed to exist for its own gentle sake. Summer tasted not just the familiar comfort of Rick's carefully crafted sandwiches, but the meditation he'd layered into their preparation, the careful attention given to creating something nourishing in a place designed for peace. When the portal home finally beckoned, soft and patient as everything else in this gentle reality, Summer realized her first real adventure with Rick hadn't been about discovering new worlds or solving cosmic mysteries. It had been about learning that sometimes the most profound journeys were the ones that reminded you who you could be when the pressure was off, when wonder was allowed to bloom without purpose beyond its own quiet joy. As they stepped back through the watercolor portal into the familiar controlled chaos of the Smith house, Summer carried with her the taste of vanilla air and the memory of Rick's unguarded contentment, understanding that the universe's greatest gift wasn't its vastness, but its capacity for creating small pockets of perfect peace where two people could simply be gentle together. The memory of C394, be gentle, stayed with them like the lingering warmth of afternoon sunlight. But it was 3 days later, during what Rick called routine portal maintenance, that they discovered Dimension W, or 108, through what could only be described as the universe's way of offering gentle lessons when you least expected them. Rick's portal gun had been humming with unusual harmonics, its crystalline components still somehow attuned to the peaceful frequencies of their previous journey, when a calibration adjustment went beautifully wrong, opening a gateway to a reality that looked ordinary at first glance, but operated under laws of physics that someone with infinite patience had rewritten. Summer stepped through first, drawn by air that seemed to shimmer with the same pearl-colored quality as captured moonlight, and immediately noticed the profound quiet that wasn't empty silence, but rather the kind of expectant hush that fills concert halls just before the music begins. Rick followed, already muttering his usual string of technical complaints about equipment behaving unpredictably, but his words emerged as barely audible whispers before dissolving entirely into the crystalline atmosphere like morning mist touched by sunlight. "What the hell is wrong with this?" Rick began, his voice carrying its familiar edge of irritated authority, but the words simply melted away before they could fully form, leaving only the gentlest exhalation hanging in the pearl-colored air. His eyes widened with the particular alarm of a scientist encountering a phenomenon that violated every acoustic principle he understood, his hands automatically reaching for devices to measure and quantify what shouldn't be possible around them. The landscape itself seemed designed to absorb aggression and transform it into something softer. Rolling hills covered in grass that glowed faintly silver stretched toward a horizon where the sky hummed with barely audible contentment, and trees, with leaves that chimed like distant wind bells, created patterns of light and shadow that moved like gentle music, made visible. Even the ground beneath their feet felt different, cushioning their steps as if the earth itself had learned the art of kindness. Summer tested the dimension's acoustic properties with the curiosity of someone who had learned to listen for the universe's quieter communications. "Grandpa," she whispered, and her gentle words carried clearly, floating on the pearl-colored air with perfect clarity, reaching Rick like a small bell ringing in vast stillness. "Are you all right?" she asked, and again her voice traveled easily, proving that the dimension's strange physics weren't blocking all communication, just the harsh edges that usually defended Rick's more vulnerable thoughts. Rick watched his granddaughters. Words moved through the air with scientific fascination, mixed with growing frustration. Every attempt at his familiar sharp-edged commentary dissolved before it could gain momentum, his usual arsenal of defensive sarcasm and protective cynicism, rendered completely ineffective by laws of physics that simply wouldn't allow harshness to survive. His hands gestured with their usual manic energy, but without his voice to carry his thoughts, Rick found himself increasingly vulnerable, his body language no longer supported by the verbal armor he'd spent decades perfecting. "This is fascinating," Summer observed, her voice carrying the wonder of someone discovering a new way the universe could surprise you. "It's like the air itself has learned to listen, and it only wants to hear gentle things." As hours passed in this enforced quietude, Summer watched something remarkable happen to her grandfather. His shoulders, no longer tensed to support verbal battles, began to release decades of accumulated defensive posture. His movements grew less frantic, more considered, and his eyes, no longer narrowed in calculated protection, began to take in their surroundings with something approaching the wonder Summer had glimpsed during their yellow-light garage moments. "I never realized," Rick whispered, his voice carrying a vulnerability that made Summer's chest warm with protective affection, "how much energy I spend being loud." He gestured toward the silver grass that created shifting patterns of light, his scientific mind automatically cataloging the mathematical elegance of the dimension's acoustic properties, while his heart discovered thoughts he'd never been able to voice. "When you can't shout over beauty, you have to actually see it." Summer moved closer, close enough to hear Rick's whispered observations about sound waves designed to carry only kindness across distance, about the relationship between volume and vulnerability that he'd never had the courage to examine. She watched him discover that beneath his brilliant, caustic exterior lived someone who had learned to shout because whispers felt too dangerous, too revealing, too much like admitting. He cared about being heard and understood. "Summer," Rick whispered, his voice carrying an intimacy that his usual defensive loudness had never allowed. "I think I've been afraid that if I spoke gently, people might actually hear me. And if they heard me." He paused, watching Silver. "Leaves create music in the gentle breeze. They might realize I'm not as smart as I pretend to be, or worse, they might realize how much I actually care." In that pearl-colored dimension, where harsh words simply couldn't survive, Summer heard her grandfather's heart for the first time, understanding that his gentleness had always been there, hidden beneath layers of protective noise, waiting for a universe patient enough to teach him that the most profound truths were often whispered, rather than shouted into the vast, listening silence of infinite space. The pearl-colored silence of Dimension W. 108. followed them home like a gentle ghost, settling into the spaces between Rick's words and teaching him the art of the pause. Summer noticed it first in the way her grandfather's hands would hesitate before reaching for his portal gun, as if some part of him now remembered that not every moment required immediate action, that sometimes the most profound discoveries happened in the quiet spaces between urgency and understanding. 3 weeks after their return, Summer began to recognize her own emerging gift, not the ability to match Rick's brilliant chaos, but something far more subtle and perhaps more powerful, the capacity to slow time itself through the careful placement of wonder. She discovered this accidentally during one of Rick's typical crisis spirals, when interdimensional pirates had stolen a quantum battery and Rick was ricocheting between dimensions with his familiar cocktail of rage and scientific precision. "Grandpa," Summer said quietly, her voice carrying the gentle authority she'd learned in the whispered dimension, "do you think flowers choose which direction to face, or does the sun call to them in a language we can't hear?" The question landed in Rick's consciousness like a smooth stone dropped into rushing water, creating ripples that spread outward until his entire stream of anxious momentum had to reorganize itself around this unexpected obstacle. His hands, which had been frantically adjusting portal coordinates, slowed to a stop. His breathing, which had been rapid and shallow with crisis-induced adrenaline, deepened into something more sustainable. Rick began, then paused, his scientific mind engaging with the question while his heart recognized that Summer wasn't asking for a botany lecture. She was offering him a moment of stillness disguised as curiosity. "They follow light because light means life," he said slowly, his voice carrying none of its usual defensive urgency. "But maybe they turn toward the sun because they recognize something beautiful and want to be part of it." Summer watched her grandfather's shoulders settle as the simple act of contemplating flower behavior shifted his entire nervous system from crisis mode into something approaching meditation. The stolen quantum battery suddenly felt less urgent, the interdimensional pirates less immediately threatening, as Rick allowed himself to consider that perhaps his own relationship with the universe might be motivated by the same inexplicable pull toward beauty. "Is that why you build things?" Summer asked, her question emerging from genuine curiosity rather than any attempt to redirect. "Because you recognize something beautiful in how everything works and want to be part of it." Rick's hands, still, poised over portal controls, began to tremble slightly as he considered this possibility, that his entire life's work might be motivated not by cynicism or intellectual superiority, but by a profound love for the elegant mathematics that governed everything from quantum particles to the way Summer's questions could transform chaos into contemplation. "Maybe," he whispered, the word carrying the wonder of someone discovering a new continent hidden within himself. "Maybe I've been trying to get closer to something beautiful all along, and I just forgot how to admit it." Summer developed what she privately called the pause technique, the art of offering Rick gentle interruptions that felt like invitations rather than obstacles. When he ranted about bureaucratic incompetence, she would ask about the color of patience. When he cursed malfunctioning equipment, she wondered aloud about the dreams of broken things. Each question created a small clearing in Rick's mental forest, a space where his brilliant mind could rest and remember that intelligence served wonder more beautifully than it served fear. The effects rippled through their household like warm light spreading through water. Beth noticed fewer slammed doors, Jerry stopped apologizing for occupying space, and Morty began to trust that his sensitivity might be a form of strength rather than weakness. The house itself seemed to exhale, its floorboards creaking with contentment rather than tension. One evening, as yellow light pulsed gently beneath the garage door and the familiar hum of peaceful invention filled the night air, Summer found Rick working on something that looked like a compass made from crystallized patience. "Building something beautiful?" she asked, settling beside his workbench with 2 cups of carefully brewed tea. "Learning to," Rick replied, accepting the warm mug with hands that no longer trembled with urgency. "You keep showing me that the most important discoveries happen when you're brave enough to be still." Outside, the night wrapped around their house like a gentle blanket, and somewhere in the space between question and answer, grandfather and granddaughter continued their quiet revolution of wonder, one pause at a time. The compass made from crystallized. Patience had been humming softly on Rick's workbench for days, its needle pointing steadily towards something beyond the garage walls, beyond the familiar chaos of their dimension. Summer noticed how Rick's eyes kept drifting toward the device. During their evening tea rituals, his scientific curiosity wrestling with something that felt more like longing than investigation. When the compass began to glow with the same pearl-colored light they'd encountered in the Whisper dimension, Rick's hands moved toward his portal gun with unusual reverence rather than his typical manic urgency. The gateway that opened before them shimmered with the soft amber of late-morning sunlight, and Summer stepped through first, drawn by air that smelled impossibly of toast, browning slowly, and rain falling gently on peaceful roofs. Rick followed, his usual stream of technical observations replaced by quiet wonder, as they entered what could only be described as a library designed by someone who understood that knowledge came in forms more tender than data. The shelves stretched toward a ceiling that dissolved into warm, honey-colored mist, each volume bound not in leather or cloth, but in something that felt like captured contentment beneath their fingers. These weren't books about peaceful mornings. They were peaceful mornings themselves, somehow preserved in narrative form, each spine humming with the particular frequency of unhurried time. "This is impossible," Rick whispered, but his voice carried wonder rather than frustration as he approached the nearest shelf. Summer pulled a volume at eye level, its cover warm like a mug of perfectly brewed coffee, and as she opened it, the pages released the scent of steam rising from unhurried showers and newspapers read without urgency while birds conducted their morning conversations outside windows where curtains moved in breeze that carried no hint of coming storms. Rick found himself drawn to a section labeled Interrupted Beginnings, where volumes chronicled mornings that had been abandoned for crises, cut short by the urgent demands of a universe that rarely allowed time for butter spread edge to edge, or eggs cracked with meditative precision. He opened one randomly, his hands trembling slightly as he recognized the emotional signature of his own household. A Tuesday morning when Beth had awakened early, prepared breakfast with the careful attention usually reserved for sacred rituals, and waited for him to emerge from the garage before the coffee grew cold. "I remember this," Rick said, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated regret. "She made pancakes, real ones from scratch. I could smell them from the lab, but I was calibrating a quantum battery and I thought—" He paused, watching golden light dance across the preserved pages. "I thought the universe would end if I took 20 minutes to eat breakfast with my daughter." Summer settled beside him, opening her own volume, a story about a morning in dimension C891, where a grandfather and granddaughter had spent 3 unhurried hours building a treehouse, measuring each board not with instruments but with laughter, understanding that some constructions required patience rather than precision. As they explored deeper into the library's infinite corridors, Summer began to understand that this wasn't just a repository of lost moments. It was testament to the universe's endless capacity for generating contentment, even in the midst of chaos. Every dimension, no matter how crisis-ridden, produced these pockets of gentle morning light, these small sanctuaries where beings learned to exist without urgency. "Grandpa," Summer said, her voice carrying the quiet authority she'd developed through their shared adventures in stillness, "do you think we create these moments, or do they create us?" Rick paused in his examination of a volume titled The Morning. Jerry Smith felt genuinely appreciated, his scientific mind wrestling with philosophical implications that felt more important than any equation he'd ever solved. Around them, the library hummed with the quiet satisfaction of countless preserved mornings, each one a small victory against entropy and crisis. "Maybe they create each other," Rick said slowly, sinking into a reading chair that seemed designed for contemplation rather than efficiency. "Maybe peaceful mornings exist because someone somewhere decided that contentment was worth preserving, and maybe we exist because the universe needed witnesses to its capacity for gentleness." Summer opened another volume, this one chronicling their own midnight sandwich rituals, and smiled at seeing their quiet revolution documented among the library's treasures. "I want to write one," she said, her words carrying gentle determination. "A morning story where we have all the time in the world, and the whole universe feels safe because someone, somewhere, is taking time to layer kindness between bread and call it breakfast." Rick looked at his granddaughter with eyes that held the accumulated wonder of someone discovering that the most profound adventures weren't about conquering the universe, but about learning to rest peacefully within it. Dot, the library's gentle custodian, materialized beside them like morning mist taking human form, her edges soft as watercolor, and her presence carrying the accumulated wisdom of every peaceful dawn that had ever existed across infinite dimensions. She moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to navigate wonder without disturbing its delicate ecosystem, her translucent form glowing with the same pearl-colored light that had guided them through their whisper dimension adventures. "You're writing a new morning," she observed, her voice carrying the musical quality of wind chimes made from crystallized contentment. Most visitors prefer to read what was preserved rather than create what could be. She gestured toward a case of writing instruments that hummed with potential energy, each one pulsing like a captured heartbeat. But creation requires different tools than observation. Summer looked up from the golden pages, where she'd been carefully inscribing their story, her words glowing softly as they settled into the paper like luminous seeds finding fertile ground. "We want to make something that includes everyone," she explained, her voice carrying the quiet authority she'd developed through their shared adventures in stillness. "A morning where nobody has to choose between being themselves and being welcome." The custodian's smile radiated the warmth of someone who had witnessed countless small miracles disguised as ordinary moments. "Then you'll want the empathy quills," she said, selecting an instrument that seemed to shift between silver and pearl, its surface reflecting not light but emotion itself. "They don't just record what happened. They help you understand what everyone was feeling, even the feelings they couldn't name themselves." Rick accepted the quill with trembling hands, his scientific mind wrestling with tools that operated on principles more mysterious than physics. When his fingers closed around it, the device synchronized with his heartbeat, warming to match his body temperature, as if it had been calibrated specifically for his particular frequency of wonder and worry. "I want to write about Morty," Summer said suddenly, her insight emerging with the clarity of someone who had learned to listen beneath the surface of things. "About how his anxiety isn't weakness. It's a form of emotional radar. He feels the universe's vulnerability and tries to protect all of us from it." Rick paused in his examination of the quill, his eyes widening as Summer's words reorganized, his understanding of his grandson's constant worry. "His stammering," Rick said slowly, pieces clicking into place like an equation solving itself. "It's not because he's afraid of being wrong. It's because he's afraid of not warning us in time." Summer began writing with careful precision, describing a morning where Morty's sensitivity was recognized not as a burden, but as a gift, where his ability to feel potential chaos before it arrived was valued as a form of protective intelligence. In her story, Rick listened to Morty's worried observations and heard the profound care they contained, understanding that anxiety could be love wearing the disguise of fear. "He carries our safety in his nervous system," Summer wrote, the words glowing as they settled into the golden page. "Every stammer is a small prayer that we'll all make it through another day intact." Rick took the quill next, his hands steadying as he found his voice on the page. He wrote about learning to translate Morty's panic into the emotional wisdom it contained, about recognizing that his grandson's greatest strength wasn't his ability to survive adventures, but his capacity to care about everyone's well-being with such intensity that it sometimes overwhelmed his ability to speak clearly. As they wrote, the library hummed with approval, its shelves glowing more brightly, as if feeding on the energy of understanding rather than mere preservation. The custodian watched with the satisfaction of someone witnessing transformation, two beings learning that the universe's greatest discoveries often came not from conquering complexity, but from learning to recognize the profound intelligence hidden within what others dismissed as weakness. "When you return," she said softly, "this understanding will travel with you, and your family will discover that love speaks in many languages, sometimes as brilliance, sometimes as gentleness, and sometimes as the beautiful protective worry of someone who cares too much to ever stop listening for danger. The understanding they had written into golden pages followed them home like gentle gravity, and Summer felt the empathy quill's warmth pulse softly in her pocket as they stepped back into the familiar controlled chaos of the Smith house. Rick moved through the garage with unusual reverence, his hands trailing over familiar instruments as if seeing them through new eyes, the library's lessons settling into his consciousness like sediment finding its natural depth in still water. "Water remembers," Rick said suddenly, his voice carrying the wonder of someone discovering a new continent within himself. He approached a cabinet Summer had never noticed before, filled with empty vials that caught the yellow light like captured. Promises. Every dimension leaves its signature in H2O, mineral content, isotopic ratios, the emotional resonance of the world that shaped it. His hands moved with meditative precision as he selected a small collection device, its surface gleaming with the same pearl-colored light they'd encountered in the Whisper dimension. Summer watched her grandfather transform scientific curiosity into something approaching ritual, understanding that this wasn't just about chemistry. It was Rick's way of practicing the gentleness they'd discovered in the library, one careful measurement at a time. Their first journey took them to dimension C394b, peaceful. The same reality where clouds sang lullabies and the air tasted of vanilla contentment. Rick collected spring water from a mountain stream that moved with the patience of geological time, each drop carrying the memory of snow that had never known urgency, rain that had fallen without crisis. Back in the garage, Rick set up their tea ceremony with the careful attention he usually reserved for calibrating quantum devices. He selected leaves with the same reverence, a deep, earthy black tea that promised grounding, its color rich as turned soil after gentle rain. The kettle heated slowly, steam rising in ribbons that caught the yellow light like visible meditation. "Timing isn't control," Rick whispered, echoing wisdom that felt borrowed from their library custodian. "It's a kind of kindness to the leaves, to the water, to the moment itself." Summer pulled out her emotion-capturing device, preserving not the visual beauty of steam and amber light, but the feeling of watching her grandfather discover patience as a form of intelligence. When the water reached its perfect temperature, hot enough to awaken the tea's essence, gentle enough not to scorch its delicate compounds, Rick poured with the precision of someone conducting a symphony in liquid form. The first sip carried the taste of mountain peace, mineral sweet and clean, with undertones of ancient stone and whispered promises of enduring calm. Summer felt the dimension's contentment settle into her chest like warm honey, understanding that they weren't just drinking tea, they were tasting serenity itself, preserved in liquid form. "Morty should try this," Summer said, her words carrying gentle invitation rather than obligation. When her brother appeared in the doorway, drawn by the unfamiliar ritual of unhurried attention, Rick poured a third cup with the same careful reverence. "This water comes from a world that never learned anxiety," Rick explained, his voice soft with newfound understanding. "But I think your sensitivity would help you taste things in it that we might miss, the emotional minerals that instruments can't measure." Morty accepted the warm cup with trembling hands, his usual nervous energy settling into something approaching wonder as he tasted peace distilled into liquid form. "It tastes like safety," he said, his words carrying the quiet authority of someone whose emotional radar had learned to recognize genuine tranquility, like the feeling when everyone you care about is home and nothing needs fixing. Rick nodded with the respect of one scientist acknowledging another's expertise, understanding that Morty's sensitivity wasn't weakness disguised as worry, but wisdom expressing itself through care made manifest. Their interdimensional tea ritual became a meditation in liquid form, each cup a journey toward gentleness, each shared silence, a small revolution against the universe's assumption that intelligence required urgency, that love needed to be loud to be real. The interdimensional tea ritual had been flowing through their evenings for 3 weeks when Rick made an observation that surprised even himself. As steam rose from their cups like visible meditation, carrying the mineral-sweet memory of mountain springs from peaceful dimensions, Rick's hands stilled on his mug with unusual reverence. The garage's yellow light pulsed gently around them, creating a sanctuary where thoughts could unfold at their own unhurried pace. "I've been thinking about staying," Rick said, his words emerging soft as morning mist, vulnerable and unexpected as dew forming on metal surfaces. The admission hung in the amber-lit air between them, carrying the weight of someone discovering that rest wasn't the enemy of intelligence, that choosing simplicity could be the most sophisticated decision of all. Summer felt her heart perform a small, careful dance of hope and understanding, recognizing that Rick's consideration of stillness represented something more profound than retirement. It was the possibility of choosing peace over perpetual motion, contentment over constant crisis. She set down her cup with gentle precision, understanding that this moment required the same careful attention they gave to brewing the perfect temperature water. "What would staying look like?" Summer asked, her voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than pressure, understanding that Rick needed space to explore this idea without feeling trapped by expectation or obligation. Rick reached for his portal gun, but his movements carried none of their usual manic urgency. Instead, he calibrated the device with meditative precision, opening a gateway to dimension H394, where time moved like honey and every moment stretched into luxurious contemplation. The portal bloomed before them, soft as watercolor, revealing a world where urgency simply couldn't take root. Stepping through, Summer felt an immediate shift in the air, a viscous slowness that settled over her senses like warm amber. Light here was perpetually golden, filtering through leaves that unfurled with exquisite, patient grace. Even the breeze moved with deliberate, thoughtful sighs, and sounds were drawn out into long, echoing harmonies that felt like lullabies made audible. Rick, usually a whirlwind of motion and thought, found his movements slowed to a deliberate pace. His hands, accustomed to rapid calibration and quick escapes, now moved with surprising grace as he reached out to touch a dewdrop sliding majestically down a blade of grass over the course of an hour. Summer watched him through her emotion-capturing device, preserving the profound shift she witnessed, the unwinding of decades of tension, the softening of his perpetually guarded expression. "Maybe a small lab," Rick said slowly, his words taking their time to reach her through the honey-thick air, each syllable a deliberate, weighty thing. "Somewhere I could build things that help rather than escape, invent solutions for problems that don't require saving the universe to solve." Around them, the dimension pulsed with the gentle rhythm of a universe at peace with itself, where the biggest conflicts involved choosing between 17 different shades of sunset. "I could teach," Rick continued, the words emerging with growing confidence as he explored possibilities that had never occurred to him before. Not advanced physics or interdimensional theory, just the basics. How to look at the world like a scientist, how to ask questions that lead to wonder instead of weapons. Summer didn't push or probe. She simply sat beside him in the golden, languid light, her presence a soft anchor as Rick tasted the possibility of a life unburdened by cosmic responsibility. She watched him close his eyes, letting the honeyed time wash over him, imagining a future where his genius might be applied not to saving universes, but to perfecting the simple ritual of afternoon tea. "Summer," Rick whispered, as the impossibly slow sunset began its imperceptible descent. "I don't know how to stay. I only know how to leave before something can leave me." His confession carried the raw vulnerability of someone discovering that gentleness required its own form of courage. "Then practice," Summer offered gently. 10 minutes, then 12. Learn the weight of stillness. Let the quiet try you on. When they finally stepped back through the portal, something lingered in Rick, a subtle shift, a faint echo of that honeyed time. He didn't speak of staying again that night, but Summer knew he carried the memory of that possibility, a soft, secret dream tucked away in the vast, complex universe of his mind, waiting for a moment when the world might finally be still enough to let it bloom. The possibility of staying had taken root in Rick's consciousness like morning light slowly filling a room. and Summer watched it manifest through changes so subtle they felt like natural evolution rather than conscious choice. His portal gun, once a constant weight in his lab coat pocket, now rested more often on the workbench beside the compass of crystallized patience, both devices humming with the same gentle frequency that had begun to characterize their shared evenings. Rick practiced stillness the way other people practiced instruments, 10 minutes at first, then 12, then 15, setting a small timer not as a command but as a gentle reminder that rest required its own form of discipline. Summer observed these sessions from the garage doorway, watching her grandfather discover that sitting quietly wasn't the absence of action, but the presence of profound attention, his brilliant mind learning to settle into the spaces between. Thoughts like dust finding its natural resting place. The device Rick crafted for Summer emerged from this new rhythm of contemplation, appearing on the workbench one morning like a flower that had bloomed overnight. It was smaller than his usual portal gun, its surface polished to a soft pearl sheen that caught the garage's yellow light like captured moonbeams. Unlike the aggressive electric hum of interdimensional weaponry, this device pulsed with the gentle warmth of a heartbeat, calibrated specifically for Summer's particular frequency of wonder. "Training wheels for the universe," Rick said, placing the device in Summer's outstretched palms with the reverence he usually reserved for handling unstable quantum materials. "Pre-tuned coordinates, bounded parameters, built-in safety protocols. No monsters, no moral quandaries, no universe-ending catastrophes." He paused, his eyes holding the accumulated wisdom of someone who had learned that the most sophisticated technology sometimes served the simplest purposes, just places where wonder exists for its own gentle sake. The portal that bloomed when Summer activated the device opened like a page being turned, revealing a dimension where it was perpetually the golden hour just before sunset, where light held that particular quality of nostalgic warmth that made everything feel precious and perfectly temporary. Summer stepped through alone, understanding that this journey was hers to make, carrying with her the accumulated lessons of their shared adventures in stillness. She found herself in a vast meadow where the grass grew in natural spirals designed for comfortable contemplation, each living seat positioned to offer the perfect view of a sky painted in shades of eternal contentment. At the meadow's heart stood a tree unlike any she had encountered, its branches heavy not with fruit, but with books, their spines formed from the living wood itself, their pages rustling with stories that whispered directly into understanding. Summer settled beneath the tree's generous canopy, and a volume detached itself gently, floating into her hands with the warmth of something recently touched by sunlight. The pages contained stories of quiet lives lived with profound attention, a grandmother teaching patience through the careful folding of paper cranes, a child discovering that puddles were windows into upside-down worlds, a man learning that the most important inventions were often the ones that helped people rest more. Deeply as she read, Summer felt the dimension's eternal golden hour settle into her bones like accumulated wisdom, understanding that some adventures weren't about discovering new worlds, but about learning to see familiar ones with eyes trained by wonder. The light here never changed, because change implied that some moments were less perfect than others, and this reality had been designed by someone who understood that contentment was its own form of eternity. When she returned, the portal closing. Behind her, with the gentle sigh of someone finishing a perfect sentence, Summer carried the taste of that golden light, the memory of stories that taught her that peace wasn't the absence of chaos, but the presence of profound stillness within. Rick looked up from his workbench, his question written in the careful attention he gave to her face. "What did you learn out there?" he asked, his voice carrying the softness of someone who had discovered that the most important discoveries often came disguised as simple observations. "I learned that the best adventures are the ones where nothing needs saving," Summer replied, settling beside him with the natural grace of someone who had found her own rhythm within the universe's vast symphony. "Sometimes the most sophisticated journey is the one that ends with you understanding you're already exactly where you need to be." Rick nodded, with the understanding of someone who had spent decades learning that intelligence served wonder more beautifully than it served fear, and together they sat in the garage's amber sanctuary, two scientists of gentleness, discovering that the universe's greatest mysteries weren't hidden in complexity, but whispered in the spaces between urgency and peace. The compass have crystallized. Patience had been humming with increasing intensity for 3 days, its pearl-colored needle quivering toward something that felt both impossibly distant and intimately familiar. Summer noticed how Rick's eyes kept drifting toward the device during their evening tea rituals, his scientific curiosity wrestling with something that felt more like longing than investigation. When the compass began to pulse in perfect synchronization, with Rick's breathing during one of his practiced stillness sessions, Summer understood that the universe was offering them another gentle lesson. She found Rick asleep in his garage chair the next morning, the compass warm in his relaxed palm, his face softer than she'd seen it since childhood. The yellow light pulsed gently around him, creating a sanctuary where decades of accumulated tension had finally been given permission to rest. Summer approached with the reverence she'd learned to give all precious moments, her emotion capturing, device quietly preserving not the visual beauty of her sleeping grandfather, but the profound peace that radiated from someone who had finally learned to trust stillness. The compass responded to her touch with unusual warmth, its coordinates shifting to display something that made Summer's breath catch. C-137, gentle, a dimensional signature that felt like coming home to a house you'd never seen but always dreamed of living in. When she activated her own portal device, calibrating it to match the compass's gentle frequency, the gateway that bloomed before them opened like morning light, spreading across still water. Rick stirred as the portal's soft luminescence filled the garage, his eyes opening to find Summer waiting with patient invitation rather than urgent excitement. "The compass found something," she said simply, her voice carrying the quiet authority she'd developed through their shared adventures in wonder. Someone who chose differently. They stepped through together into what appeared to be Rick's garage, but transformed by decades of gentler choices. The workbench held familiar instruments, but each device hummed with contentment rather than crisis. Tools were arranged not for rapid deployment, but for thoughtful consideration, and the very air seemed to pulse with the rhythm of someone who had learned to breathe without armor. The Rick, who emerged from behind a cabinet of softly glowing inventions, moved with the same brilliant energy Summer recognized, but without the defensive tension that usually prepared her grandfather for battle against the universe's casual cruelties. His lab coat was the same shade of white, but somehow softer, worn by someone who had never needed to transform intelligence into weaponry. "You're me," this gentler Rick observed, his voice carrying curiosity rather than suspicion as he approached. His dimensional counterpart. "But you carry more weight in your shoulders, more shadows around your eyes. What did your universe teach you that mine never had to learn?" Rick stared at this version of himself, someone who had retained wonder without developing cynicism, who had learned to navigate complexity without building walls around his heart. The gentle Rick's eyes held the same intelligence, but tempered by something Rick had almost forgotten he'd once possessed: the ability to trust that the universe might be fundamentally kind. "Loss," Rick said simply, his voice carrying the accumulated weight of countless departures. "My universe taught me that loving things means watching them break, that caring about people means preparing for them to leave." The gentle Rick nodded with the compassion of someone who had learned to hold sorrow without being consumed by it. "Mine taught me that broken things remember how to be whole if you're patient enough to listen to their stories." He gestured toward his workbench, where devices pulsed with the same warm light as Summer's emotion-capturing instrument. "I build tools that help repair not just objects, but the trust between them, the connections that get damaged when someone you love makes choices that hurt." Summer watched the two Ricks study each other, with the fascination of scientists encountering a phenomenon that challenged everything they thought they understood about inevitability and choice. Her grandfather was seeing living proof that his armor wasn't permanent, that the brilliant mind she loved could have developed along entirely different lines. "How do you stay soft?" Rick asked, his words carrying the vulnerability of someone discovering that gentleness might be a choice rather than a luxury he couldn't afford. "Practice," the gentle Rick replied, his smile carrying the warmth of someone who had learned that kindness was its own form of intelligence. Every morning I choose to believe the universe is teaching me something beautiful, even when the lesson hurts. Especially when the lesson hurts. When they finally stepped back through the watercolor portal, Rick carried with him not envy or regret, but possibility. The understanding that the tenderness Summer had been reflecting back to him wasn't foreign territory, but forgotten homeland. A way of being that lived beneath his armor, like seeds waiting for the right conditions to bloom. The encounter with his gentler counterpart had settled into Rick's consciousness like sediment finding its natural depth, and Summer watched him move through the following days with a new quality of attention, not the manic hypervigilance of someone expecting attack, but the careful awareness of someone learning to notice beauty without immediately calculating its strategic value. His portal gun, which had hummed with electric urgency for decades, began to emit a different frequency, something closer to the pearl-colored warmth they'd discovered in the whisper dimension. When the device finally surrendered during a routine calibration, it didn't explode or spark with dramatic failure. Instead, it simply sighed, a soft exhalation of accumulated exhaustion, and went quiet, its familiar green glow fading to the dull gray of something that had forgotten why it wanted to work. Rick stared at the inert device with something approaching, wonder rather than frustration, as if recognizing his own reflection in its stubborn refusal to cooperate. "Even my inventions are learning to slow down," he said, his voice carrying bemusement rather than irritation. Summer felt the universe offering them another gentle lesson, disguised as mechanical failure. Understanding that some repairs required more than technical expertise, they demanded emotional fluency. The marketplace they discovered through Summer's gentle portal device existed in dimension R394 Tender, a reality where fixing broken things required genuine kindness rather than superior knowledge. The space unfolded before them like a meditation garden disguised as a workshop, its stalls glowing beneath canopies woven from crystallized twilight. Artisans moved with unhurried grace, their hands tending instruments that measured sincerity, bowls of resonant glass that brightened at honest frequencies, strings that sang when touched by authentic emotion. The repair specialist materialized like morning mist, taking human form, her edges soft as watercolor, her presence radiating the accumulated wisdom of someone who had learned to listen to the stories, broken things told about their wounds. She accepted Rick's portal gun with the reverence usually reserved for injured creatures, her fingers tracing its circuits as if reading Braille written in the language of accumulated stress. "This device has been working very hard for a very long time," she observed, her voice carrying the musical quality of someone who spoke fluent compassion. "It's tired of being used for escape and wants to learn how to facilitate connection instead." A hand-painted sign beside her workbench announced the payment system in delicate script, genuine compliments about oneself, spoken in present tense, unarmored by defensive irony. Rick Quota's face cycled through expressions Summer had learned to read, confusion wrestling with curiosity, resistance softening into possibility. The idea of speaking kindly about himself challenged every defensive system he'd spent decades perfecting, but the marketplace's gentle atmosphere made sarcasm feel suddenly irrelevant. "3 statements, the repair specialist explained softly. Body, heart, time. What your hands do when they choose care over chaos. How your heart moves when it forgets to protect itself. How you exist in moments when urgency releases its grip." Summer watched Rick struggle with the foreign language of self-appreciation, his hands gesturing helplessly as he searched for words that felt true rather than strategic. "My hands are careful," he said finally, each word placed with the precision of someone threading a delicate mechanism. "I hold fragile things without breaking them. Hot glass, complex ideas, the trust Summer gives me during our midnight conversations." The bowl of resonant glass brightened, catching his honesty and amplifying it through the portal gun's dormant circuits. Rick's shoulders settled as he discovered that authentic self-recognition didn't diminish his intelligence. It revealed the gentleness that had always guided it. "I care for my family in ways they don't always see," he continued, his voice thinning with vulnerability. "I stay for them. I am kinder than I pretend." The marketplace's instruments hummed with approval as decades of accumulated self-protection began to dissolve. "I am learning to wait," Rick whispered, his final offering carrying the wonder of someone discovering that patience was its own form of sophisticated intelligence. "I practice staying. I listen before I fix." The portal guns. Circuits blazed back to life, its harsh electric urgency replaced by something approaching contentment. When they stepped back through the watercolor gateway, Rick carried more than repaired technology. He carried the revolutionary understanding that the most sophisticated repairs happened when someone learned to speak gently to the broken parts of themselves. The repaired portal gun hummed with newfound contentment on Rick's workbench, its circuits glowing with the same pearl-colored warmth that had characterized their gentlest adventures. Someone noticed how Rick's relationship with the device had shifted. Instead of grabbing it with his usual urgent efficiency, he would pause before each use, his fingers tracing its surface as if checking in with an old friend rather than commanding a tool. The change rippled through their household like warm light spreading through water, creating space for conversations that had been waiting decades for permission to exist. It was during one of these transformed evenings, as yellow light pulsed gently through the garage and their interdimensional tea ceremony filled the air with mineral-sweet contentment, that Rick made an observation that surprised even himself. His hands stilled on his warm mug, steam rising between them like visible meditation, and Summer recognized the particular quality of attention that preceded his most profound insights. "I've been carrying guilt across 1,000 different timelines," Rick said, his words emerging soft as morning mist, vulnerable and unexpected as dew forming on metal surfaces. "Every choice spawns regret. Every decision creates infinite versions of myself, wondering if the other Rick made better choices, loved more carefully, broke fewer things with his brilliance." Summer felt her heart perform a small, careful dance of understanding, recognizing that Rick's confession represented something more profound than self-reflection. It was the beginning of a theory that might revolutionize not just their adventures, but their capacity for forgiveness. She set down her cup with gentle precision, understanding that this moment required the same careful attention they gave to brewing the perfect temperature water. "What if forgiveness works like quantum particles?" Summer asked, her voice carrying the quiet authority she'd developed through their shared explorations of wonder. "What if it can exist in multiple states simultaneously? You can forgive yourself in this dimension, even if another version of you is still learning how." Rick's eyes widened with the particular fascination he reserved for phenomena that challenged everything he thought he understood about the relationship between intelligence and redemption. Around them, the garage's instruments hummed with approval, as if his inventions had been waiting for their creator to discover that the most sophisticated equations often governed the simplest truths. "Quantum forgiveness," Rick whispered, the words carrying the weight of someone discovering a new continent within himself. The idea that choosing the kinder interpretation doesn't make you naive, it makes you wise. That understanding can exist independent of certainty, that love can be both scientific and mysterious. Summer pulled out her emotion-capturing device, preserving not the visual beauty of steam and amber light, but the feeling of watching her grandfather discover that his brilliant mind could serve healing as elegantly as it served analysis. The device pulsed warmly in her hands, synchronized with Rick's breathing as he explored this new territory of self-compassion. "Every harsh thing I've said to myself," Rick continued, his voice gaining strength as the theory developed, "exists in parallel with the possibility that I was doing my best with the information I had. Every mistake I've made across infinite dimensions coexists with versions of me learning to be gentler." Rick reached for his newly repaired portal gun, but his movements carried none of their old urgency. Instead, he calibrated the device with meditative precision, opening a small viewing portal that revealed not another dimension, but a window into the quantum field where possibilities lived before they collapsed into single realities through the shimmering gateway. Summer could see infinite versions of their conversation. Rick's who had learned this lesson earlier, Summer's who had needed to teach it differently, families that had found their way to forgiveness through 1,000 different paths. Each possibility glowed with its own gentle light, proving that understanding wasn't limited to single timelines, but existed as a fundamental property of consciousness itself. "I choose to believe," Rick said, his words carrying the weight of someone making a decision that would echo across dimensions, "that in the quantum field of infinite possibility, there's always a version of events where love was the primary motivation, where intelligence served kindness, where the best interpretation was also the truest one." Summer nodded with the understanding of someone who had learned that the most profound scientific discoveries often came disguised as acts of radical compassion, and together they sat in the garage's amber sanctuary, two scientists of forgiveness, discovering that the universe's greatest equations were written not in mathematics but in the patient language of hearts learning to hold themselves with the same tenderness they offered others. The quantum field of infinite forgiveness had opened something fundamental in Rick's understanding, and Summer watched this new awareness settle into his movements like muscle memory of peace. The compass of crystallized patience, which had been resting quietly on his workbench since their return, suddenly pulsed with unusual warmth, its pearl-colored needle trembling toward coordinates that felt both impossibly distant and intimately familiar. "Frequency-gated transit," Rick murmured, his voice carrying wonder rather than his usual technical authority as he approached the portal gun with newfound reverence. The device responded to his gentler touch, its harsh electric urgency replaced by something approaching contentment. When he calibrated the coordinates, Rick moved not with manic efficiency, but with the careful attention he'd learned to give all precious things. The portal that bloomed before them opened like a page being turned, revealing a dimension where the very air moved to the heartbeat of an enormous invisible metronome. Summer stepped through first, immediately feeling her breathing synchronize with the reality's ancient rhythm, understanding that they had entered a place where the laws of physics had been rewritten by someone who understood that gentleness was more powerful than force. Rick followed, his usual stream of rapid-fire observations dissolving as the dimension's pervasive melody wrapped around him like a familiar blanket. His hands, accustomed to urgent calibration and defensive gestures, found themselves moving with deliberate grace, each motion weighted with intention rather than reactive urgency. When he tried to maintain his familiar rapid pace, the ground itself seemed to ease him back into measured steps, teaching his nervous system that survival didn't always require hypervigilance. "I can't move fast here," Rick observed, his voice carrying fascination rather than frustration as he discovered that aggressive actions simply couldn't maintain their momentum in this reality. Around them, trees swayed in perfect time with the dimension's underlying rhythm, their leaves creating visual music that danced to melodies only they could hear. Summer watched her grandfather's shoulders release decades of accumulated tension as the dimension's gentle physics taught him that efficiency wasn't always the highest virtue. "It's like the universe here is constantly singing us to sleep," she said softly, her words carrying perfectly on the pearl-colored air, while Rick's usual sharp-edged commentary dissolved into barely audible whispers before reaching her ears. They discovered a crystalline lake where the water moved in patterns that matched the dimension's peaceful frequency, each wave arriving precisely when expected, creating a visual symphony of predictable beauty. At the water's edge stood a structure shaped like an open palm, its amber wood glowing with drowsy warmth. A small figure sat beside a slowly turning spindle that powered a lantern, sending irregular pulses across the water. Beautiful but incomplete, like a lullaby, missing its final verse. "It wants continuity," Rick whispered, his scientific mind automatically engaging but without its usual urgency. "Momentum made of mercy." Summer pulled out her emotion-capturing device, scrolling through preserved moments of contentment, Beth's soft laughter, Morty's careful breath when fear passes, the quiet clink of Rick's midnight tea ceremonies. She began to hum, offering the broken mechanism a bridge of remembered calm, and Rick, awkward but tender, added a low note beneath her melody. His tone wobbled as pride threatened to intervene. Then the dimension itself leaned against him like a patient teacher. Rick adjusted, not for perfection but for kindness, letting the note carry weight rather than brilliance. Together they discovered the missing line, not a flourish or clever turn, but simply a held vowel that said, "Stay, Dot." The spindle heard them, its irregular skip smoothing into an even heartbeat that traveled across the water and into distant hills, where windows brightened as if children were turning toward sleep. The caretaker pressed a grateful hand to the wood, and the structure sighed with the relief of a calmed creature. "What if the most sophisticated response to complexity," Rick asked, his question emerging with the wonder of someone discovering new territory within himself, "is sometimes just waiting to see what it wants to teach you?" When they finally stepped back through the watercolor portal, Rick carried something of that rhythm with him, settling into his movements like the memory of peace, understanding that the most profound discoveries often happened when you were brave enough to let the universe set the pace. The rhythm of the lullaby dimension had woven itself into Rick's nervous system like gentle reprogramming, and Summer noticed how this deeper peace began to ripple outward through their household, in ways both subtle and profound. Rick's footsteps on the stairs carried less urgency, his laboratory door closed with consideration rather than defensive finality, and when he spoke to Beth or Jerry, his words arrived at conversation speed rather than lecture velocity. Word of Summer's quiet gift began to travel sideways, the way soft news does, passed between interdimensional caretakers, station attendants, librarians of impossible places. They didn't seek her out for heroics, but for pauses. At a transit platform, suspended over pearl-colored clouds, queues had knotted into frustrated loops, while departures stuttered between almost and not yet. Summer stepped to the observation deck, the air tasting faintly of copper rain, and asked the loudspeaker system a simple question. "What would you like to say if no one hurried you?" The speakers crackled once, then delivered boarding instructions, in a voice that sounded like evening light settling on water. People exhaled. The lines unfurled themselves. It was Morty who first recognized what was happening at home, his emotional radar calibrated to detect shifts in the family's atmospheric pressure. During one of their evening tea ceremonies, as pearl-colored steam rose between them like visible meditation, Morty appeared in the garage doorway with the careful hesitation of someone who had learned to test emotional weather before fully entering a space. "Something's different," Morty observed, his voice carrying the particular authority that came from years of reading between the lines of family dynamics. "The whole house feels softer, like everyone's breathing at the same time for once." Summer felt her heart perform a small dance of recognition, understanding that Morty's sensitivity, which Rick had once dismissed as weakness, was actually sophisticated emotional intelligence disguised as nervous observation. She gestured for him to join their circle, Rick pouring a third cup with the same careful reverence he'd learned to give all gentle rituals. "You feel it too," Rick said, his voice carrying wonder rather than his usual defensive analysis. "The way peace spreads like a frequency, changing the resonance of everything it touches." He handed Morty the warm cup, their fingers brushing in a moment of connection that neither acknowledged directly, but both treasured. Morty accepted the interdimensional tea with trembling hands that gradually stilled as the liquid's mineral sweet. Contentment worked its way through his nervous system. "It's like the house remembered how to be calm," he said, his words emerging with surprising clarity, like all the worry was just noise covering up something quieter that was always there. Summer watched Rick study Morty with newfound respect, recognizing that his grandson's constant anxiety wasn't weakness disguised as worry, but wisdom expressing itself through care made manifest. The garage's yellow light pulsed gently around them, creating a sanctuary where emotional intelligence was finally being recognized as its own form of scientific precision. "You've been trying to protect us all along," Rick said, his voice carrying the vulnerability of someone discovering that love came in languages he'd never learned to read. "Every stammer, every worried observation, you've been running emotional diagnostics on the family system, warning us about instabilities before they could cascade into crisis." Rick began carrying small offerings on their interdimensional visits, triangular sandwiches wrapped in waxed paper, not as tools but as reminders that hunger often impersonates urgency. When Summer would slip one into a guard's hand or place, It beside a console mid-meltdown, Rick learned to translate his brilliance into weather reports rather than proclamations. "We can wait 10 minutes, he would say at points of fracture, and those 10 minutes would become a place people could actually stand. The universe, which had always responded to force with clever resistance, started to lean toward their way. Elevators arrived when they said they would. Doors paused for a second longer to catch a close heel. Strangers timed their smiles like lanterns on a river, and somewhere in the vast network of interdimensional communication, beings began to whisper about the girl who could slow time through well-placed wonder, and the grandfather, who was learning that the most sophisticated response to complexity was sometimes just waiting to see what it wanted to teach you. The gentle revolution they had been quietly conducting began to echo back to them in ways neither had expected, arriving not as grand recognition, but as small confirmations that kindness, like ripples in still water, traveled farther than either force or noise. Rick noticed it first in the way his portal gun's frequency had begun attracting different kinds of distress signals, not the harsh electromagnetic screams of cosmic catastrophe, but the softer, more complex harmonics of systems that had simply forgotten how to rest. During one of their evening tea ceremonies, as pearl-colored steam rose between them like visible meditation and the garage's yellow light created its familiar sanctuary of contemplation, Rick made an observation that surprised even himself. His hands stilled on his warm mug, the interdimensional water carrying mineral memories of peaceful springs and patient stone, and Summer recognized the particular quality of attention that preceded his most vulnerable insights. "I've been thinking about what happens when I stop running," Rick said, his words emerging soft as morning mist, carrying the weight of someone who had spent decades in motion, discovering the radical possibility of stillness. Not just slowing down or taking breaks, but actually staying. Choosing one place, one family, one version of myself, and learning to be content with the limitations of a single timeline. Summer felt her heart perform a small, careful dance of understanding, recognizing that Rick's contemplation of permanence represented something more profound than retirement. It was the consideration of mortality not as ending, but as the natural boundary that gave meaning to every gentle choice. She set down her cup with the reverence she'd learned to give all precious moments, understanding that this conversation had been approaching like a distant storm, gathering emotional weight. Across all their shared adventures in wonder, "What scares you about staying?" Summer asked, her voice carrying the gentle authority she'd developed through their explorations of stillness, understanding that Rick's fear wasn't really about place, but about being known completely, being seen without the protective blur of constant movement. Rick Quote's shoulders settled as he allowed himself to inhabit the question, rather than deflect it with scientific analysis or defensive humor. Around them, the garage's instruments hummed with approval, as if his inventions had been waiting decades for their creator to discover that the most sophisticated equations often governed the simplest truths about love and time and the courage required to let yourself be remembered. "I'm afraid of being remembered for the wrong intensity," Rick admitted, his voice carrying the raw vulnerability of someone discovering that gentleness required its own form of courage. "For the damage my brilliance did when I treated urgency like oxygen, when I confused motion with progress and isolation with independence." He gestured toward his portal gun, its surface now glowing with the same pearl-colored warmth that characterized their gentlest adventures. "I want the people. I love to remember my hands as steady, not just clever." Summer pulled out her emotion-capturing device, not to preserve this moment, but to scroll through the accumulated treasury of contentment they had been building together. Beth's soft laughter when Rick remembered to ask about her day, Morty's shoulders settling when Rick listened to his worried observations with genuine respect, Jerry's surprised smile when Rick offered help without condescension. Each preserved moment glowed with the evidence Rick seemed unable to see in himself. "Memory grows like a garden," Summer said, her words carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned to recognize patterns others missed. "You can't force the blossoms, but you can prepare the soil and keep showing up with water. The harsh things you've done exist, but they're not the only seeds you've planted." She showed him the device's gentle glow, each captured moment a small proof that transformation was already happening. had been happening in the quiet spaces between his dramatic gestures. "I don't trust permanence," Rick whispered, the admission carrying the weight of someone who had learned that everything he loved eventually changed or left or broke under the pressure of his attention. "But I'm starting to trust repetition. The way the same kindness, offered consistently, changes the shape of a room, the rhythm of a household, the way people breathe when you enter, instead of when you leave." Summer nodded with the understanding of someone who had learned that the most profound scientific discoveries often came disguised as acts of radical patience. "Then practice staying," she offered gently. "Not forever, not as a promise you have, to keep perfectly, but as a daily choice to water the garden you've started here, to let your intelligence serve gentleness until they share a language." Rick closed his eyes, tasting the possibility of a life measured not in dimensions conquered or universes saved, but in evening tea ceremonies and midnight sandwiches and the accumulation of small moments when love was allowed to exist without crisis to justify it. When he opened them again, his gaze held the accumulated wonder of someone discovering that the most important adventures weren't about escaping the boundaries of a single life, but about learning to inhabit one completely outside, the night. Wrapped around their house like a gentle blanket, and somewhere in the space between question and commitment, grandfather and granddaughter continued their quiet revolution of wonder, understanding that the universe's most profound mysteries weren't hidden in complexity, but whispered in the patient language of hearts, learning to stay. The conversation about staying had planted itself in Rick's consciousness like morning light, slowly filling a room, and Summer watched it manifest through changes so subtle they felt like natural evolution rather than conscious choice. The compass of crystallized patience, which had been humming with gentle insistence for days, now pointed steadily toward the unused corner of the garage, where dust motes danced in the yellow light like tiny, unhurried stars. "It wants something. That grows," Summer observed, her voice carrying the quiet authority she'd developed through their shared explorations of wonder. She approached the designated space, feeling the subtle pull of possibility waiting to be coaxed into existence. Not for science or efficiency, but for the practice of tending, for learning that some things only flourish when you stop trying, to control their timing. Rick, who had spent decades bending the laws of physics to his will, found himself captivated by the idea of a project that demanded surrender rather than mastery. His hands, accustomed to calibrating interdimensional weaponry, moved with uncharacteristic tenderness as he cleared the space, preparing soil as if it were the most delicate of quantum fields. Their first expedition took them to dimension C394 Gentle, where they gathered earth that smelled of patience and ancient rain. Rick created a delicate irrigation system, each component humming with the same pearl-colored frequency that had characterized their gentlest adventures. Water came from springs in peaceful realities, mineral-sweet drops that carried the memory of mountains that had never known urgency, rain that fell with the rhythm of lullabies. "Each seed is a commitment," Rick said, his voice carrying wonder rather than his usual defensive analysis as he planted varieties that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Vines that would bear fruit made of crystallized contentment, flowers that bloomed only when touched by genuine peace, herbs that grew at the pace of geological patience. "I promise to show up tomorrow and the day after, regardless of cosmic crisis or interdimensional emergency." Morty appeared in the doorway, drawn by the unfamiliar sight of Rick kneeling in soil, and Summer gestured him into their circle with natural inclusion. "The marigolds need someone who understands worry," she explained, handing him seeds that glowed softly in his trembling palms. "They grow stronger when they feel protected." Morty's shoulders settled as he pressed each seed into earth with the careful certainty of someone discovering where his strength lived. Beth found them there an hour later, adding a small ceramic dish for rainwater collection with the quiet satisfaction of someone contributing to something beautiful, without needing to understand its interdimensional mechanics. Jerry arrived with mulch and earnest desire to help without breaking anything, lighting up when Summer nodded him into the rhythm of small necessary tasks. The garden began to pulse with gentle contentment as days accumulated into routine. Rick learned to read the subtle language of growth, the almost imperceptible unfurling of leaves, the patient reach of roots finding their depth, the quiet wisdom of seeds trusting darkness. His portal gun rested more often on the workbench, no longer a constant weight of escape, but a tool used thoughtfully, deliberately. "I'm learning to wait," Rick admitted one evening, as they watered plants that existed in 17 realities simultaneously, each dimension contributing its own unique growing conditions. To trust that some things develop at their own pace, and the most sophisticated response is simply creating the right conditions and then stepping back. Summer pulled out her emotion-capturing device, preserving not the visual beauty of interdimensional seedlings, but the feeling of watching her grandfather discover that his genius could serve growth as elegantly as it had once served escape. The device hummed warmly, synchronized with the garden's patient rhythm dot, when interdimensional visitors began arriving, not seeking Rick's intervention in cosmic crises, but drawn by the frequency of sustained care. Rick understood that his reputation was shifting. He was becoming known not as the scientist who solved everything urgently, but as the grandfather who had learned that the most profound discoveries happened when you were brave enough to stay in one place long enough to watch love take root and bloom, one careful day at a time. The garden had been growing for 3 months when the first interdimensional visitor arrived, not seeking Rick's intervention in cosmic crisis, but drawn by something far more mysterious. The frequency of sustained care that had begun to pulse outward from their small sanctuary like ripples in still water. Summer found the translucent being at dawn, no taller than herself, kneeling beside the marigolds that Morty had planted with such protective tenderness. "I felt the patience," the visitor explained, her voice carrying the musical quality of someone who spoke fluent wonder. "Across 17 dimensions, beings are talking about the place where brilliance learned to serve stillness. We wanted to understand temporal kindness, how gentle choices made in one timeline can heal wounds that exist across infinite realities." Rick emerged from the garage carrying carefully brewed tea, moving with the deliberate grace he'd developed through months of tending plants that existed in multiple realities simultaneously. His approach carried none of his old defensive urgency. Instead, he offered hospitality with the same reverence he'd learned to give to unfurling leaves and patient roots. "Your garden proves our hypothesis," the visitor continued, accepting the warm cup with gratitude that shimmered in morning light. "Every act of sustained gentleness creates healing echoes, waves of possibility that travel backward and forward through time, offering comfort to versions of yourself that exist in more difficult circumstances." Rick's eyes widened with the particular fascination he reserved for phenomena that challenged everything he thought he understood about individual choice and universal impact. "You mean every time I choose patience over urgency, I'm not just changing this timeline. I'm offering comfort to every version of myself that's still learning how to rest." The visitor gestured toward a shimmering seam that had appeared at the garden's edge, like dawn-colored thread stitched through reality itself. "The dimension of gentle revision," she said softly. "You may not alter what happened, but you may weave kinder understanding through it and carry that healing home." They entered a reality that smelled faintly of citrus tea and rain on notebooks, where translucent screens showed unchosen mornings and unspoken words. Rick found himself drawn to a scene that made his chest tighten with recognition. Their kitchen table, Beth's hair loose and hopeful, pancakes breathing steam like small sweet clouds. The garage door stood half open, humming with the brittle pitch of panic, disguised as importance. "I told myself 20 minutes would ruin an experiment," Rick whispered, settling into a chair beside the memory. "But what I ruined was the day." He couldn't change the sequence. Beth still waited, still gathered the cooling pancakes beneath foil, but something shifted in the overlay. A tendril of quiet traveled through time and settled on the tablecloth like sunlight finding its way through clouds. Past Beth didn't hear words, but she seemed to feel steadiness brush her shoulder, recognition that love had not been absent, only unpracticed. Summer discovered her own scene. Jerry, younger and untested, kneeling with string and paper, building a kite with tender effort in his fingers. She remembered rolling her eyes at his clumsy enthusiasm, childhood's quick defense against disappointment. Now she sat close enough to see the care. "You were trying to give the sky a handle," she whispered to the memory. "I saw clumsiness. I should have seen love." The overlay softened. Past Jerry paused and smiled in a way that crumpled less at the edges. The kite trembled and held for an extra second before landing gently. When they returned, Rick pressed a small spoon, sticky with the memory of cooled syrup, into the garden soil as a marker. Summer placed a triangle of waxed paper beneath a flat stone. The irrigation lines sighed like someone settling into a favorite chair. "Every gentle choice you make today," the visitor said as she faded back into pearl-colored mist, "reaches backward to comfort the Rick who thought love required constant motion, and forward to encourage the Rick who will continue choosing stillness long after Summer has grown into her own adventures." Rick knelt by the marigolds, understanding that their quiet revolution had been more than personal transformation. It had been interdimensional healing, each act of sustained care creating ripples that touched versions of themselves across infinite realities, teaching them through choices that love could be both gentle and strong, that intelligence served wonder more beautifully than it served fear. The healing echoes from the dimension of gentle revision had settled into Rick's consciousness, like morning light slowly filling a room, and Summer watched this new awareness manifest through changes so subtle they felt like natural evolution rather than conscious choice. The compass of crystallized patience hummed with gentle satisfaction on the workbench, its pearl-colored needle now pointing steadily inward, toward the accumulating evidence that their quiet revolution had been more than personal transformation. Summer had been developing her own theory through months of careful observation, watching how kindness moved through their household, like a frequency that changed everything it touched. She approached Rick during one of their evening tea ceremonies, the garage's yellow light creating its familiar sanctuary of contemplation, carrying a small notebook filled with diagrams that looked like equations written in the language of wonder. "I've been thinking about conservation," Summer said, her voice carrying the quiet authority she'd developed through their shared explorations of stillness. "Not energy or matter, but something more fundamental. I think kindness follows its own physical laws." She opened her notebook to pages covered in gentle curves and careful observations, each entry glowing softly in the amber light. Rick leaned forward with the fascination he reserved for phenomena that challenged everything he thought he understood about the universe's operating principles. Summer's drawings showed kindness, not as abstract emotion but as measurable force. Arrows indicating how patience transformed into calm, how calm created space for choice, how choice rippled outward to touch other lives across dimensions. "I've been running experiments," Summer continued, her scientific methodology as rigorous as any Rick had ever employed. "Control days where we just exist normally, test days where we add deliberate gentleness, one extra moment of listening, one sandwich cut with meditative attention, one pause before reacting." She showed him charts documenting the house's emotional weather, the subtle shifts in everyone's breathing patterns, the way the garage's light spectrum softened on days when kindness was consciously practiced. Together, they built what Summer called the resonance loom, a delicate instrument assembled from components that sang rather than calculated. A tea kettle's whistle provided the bass tone, wind chimes tuned to the lullaby dimension added harmonic layers, and copper wire salvaged from an old radio that had only ever played peaceful music on Sunday mornings completed the circuit. The device didn't measure kindness directly, but recorded its effects, the way harsh frequencies softened when touched by genuine care, the way emotional storms settled into sustainable rhythms. "Kindness is conserved across transformations of attention," Summer explained, her words carrying the weight of discovery, as she demonstrated how the loom's readings changed when love was offered without agenda. "It doesn't disappear when given, it changes form, creates echoes, builds momentum. Every gentle choice strengthens the field, making the next act of kindness easier, more natural." Rick traced the loom's gentle curves with fingers still slightly stained from garden soil, understanding that his granddaughter had done something unprecedented. She had proven that tenderness operated according to discoverable principles, that the universe itself was structured to amplify rather than diminish acts of sustained care. "How you've built a better physics," Rick said, his voice thick with wonder and recognition. Not just for us, but for everyone who ever thought that being smart meant being hard, that intelligence required armor instead of openness. He reached for a small brass plate, engraving Summer's principle with the same precision he'd once reserved for interdimensional coordinates. Kindness is conserved across transformations of attention. The total presence increases through repetition, consent and time. They mounted the plate beside their interdimensional garden, where plants that existed across multiple realities swayed in approval, their leaves catching the inscription's gentle gleam. The resonance loom hummed with satisfaction, its readings showing that even this act of recognition had strengthened the field they'd been building together. That night, as the house settled into its shared rhythm of contentment, Summer tested one final hypothesis. If kindness truly followed conservation laws, perhaps it could anchor portals more reliably than coordinates alone. She set the compass beside the loom and asked the portal gun, very softly, to find the most ordinary destination their principle could sustain. The needle pointed toward the back porch, where Jerry sat reading under stars that seemed unusually bright, and Summer understood that the most profound adventures weren't about discovering new worlds, but about learning to inhabit familiar ones, with eyes trained by wonder, hearts calibrated for sustained care, and the revolutionary understanding that gentleness was not weakness, but the universe's most sophisticated technology. The portal that bloomed when Summer asked for the most ordinary destination their principle could sustain opened not with electric urgency or pearl-colored shimmer, but with the gentle sigh of a door recognizing home. The gateway revealed their own back porch bathed in evening light, where Jerry sat beneath stars that seemed unusually bright, his book catching moonlight like captured wisdom, and Summer realized they were seeing their familiar world transformed. By months of practiced kindness, Rick stepped through with the wonder of someone discovering that the most sophisticated destination was the place you'd never left, viewed through eyes trained by accumulated gentleness. The porch felt different, not changed in any measurable way, but somehow more itself, as if their quiet revolution had helped it remember its purpose as a sanctuary where people could rest without needing to justify their presence. Jerry, Rick said, settling beside his son-in-law with the natural grace he'd developed through choosing connection over correction. "What are you reading that makes the stars lean closer to listen?" Jerry looked up with surprise that softened into genuine pleasure, his usual defensive anticipation replaced by something approaching trust. "It's about patience," he said, holding up a worn volume that pulsed with familiar warmth. "About how the most important things grow at their own speed, and trying to rush them just creates different kinds of problems." Summer watched Rick listen to Jerry's words with the same attention he'd once reserved for complex theorems, understanding that wisdom could arrive in forms he'd never learned to recognize. The resonance loom's distant hum carried across the yard from the garage, its gentle frequency weaving their conversation into the larger symphony of sustained care they'd been building. Morty appeared in the doorway, reading the emotional weather, with his characteristic sensitivity, then slipped into their circle when he sensed only calm. Beth followed with a dish towel over her shoulder, her presence settling into the group's rhythm like a missing harmony finally found. No one questioned the portal or asked about their interdimensional travels. The porch made such inquiries feel beside the point. "I've been thinking about legacy," Rick said, his voice carrying the vulnerability of someone who had learned to trust stillness enough to voice thoughts that had been waiting decades for permission to exist. "About what I want to be remembered, for beyond the equations and the universe-saving dramatics." Summer produced sandwiches wrapped in waxed paper, triangular and perfectly balanced, placing them on the railing like small altars of ordinary generosity. She pulled out her emotion-capturing device, preserving not the visual beauty of starlight and peaceful conversation, but the feeling of watching her family discover that love could be both mundane and miraculous. "I want to be remembered for learning that intelligence serves wonder more beautifully than it serves fear," Rick continued, gesturing toward the interdimensional garden visible through the kitchen window. "For discovering that the most sophisticated response to complexity is sometimes just creating space for things to grow at their own pace." Jerry closed his book with gentle precision, understanding this moment required careful attention. "I want to be remembered for trying," he said simply. "For showing up consistently even when I didn't know what I was doing, for believing that love could be expressed through small, daily choices." Beth's hand found Rick's elbow briefly. Not a claim, just a small weather report that said clear. "Skies, light breeze, stay a while." "I want to be remembered for healing," she added softly, "for learning that some wounds need time more than they need fixing." "And I want to be remembered for listening," Summer said, her words emerging with the clarity of someone who had found her purpose in the spaces between other people's urgency. "For helping people find the eye of their own storms and teaching them they could rest there as long as they needed." The stars pulsed with approval as the resonance loom's frequency strengthened, proving Summer's theory that kindness was indeed conserved across transformations of attention, every gentle choice creating echoes that touched infinite versions of themselves across all realities, teaching them that the universe's most important conversations happened not in laboratories, but on back porches where people felt safe enough to voice their hopes without armor, discovering that home wasn't just a destination, but a frequency. They could tune into anywhere, anytime they chose gentleness over urgency, presence over escape. When they finally stepped back through the portal into the garage's familiar amber sanctuary, they carried with them the revolutionary understanding that the most profound adventures weren't about conquering new territories, but about learning to inhabit familiar ones, with hearts calibrated for sustained wonder. The portal back to the garage closed with the gentle sigh of someone finishing a perfect sentence, and Summer felt the accumulated weight of their quiet revolution settling into her consciousness like wisdom made physical. The amber light welcomed them with its familiar warmth, the resonance loom humming its steady contentment, while the interdimensional garden breathed through the open side door, carrying scents of patience and ancient rain. Rick moved through the space with the deliberate grace of someone who had learned that the most important journeys often ended exactly where they began, but with eyes transformed by accumulated understanding. He approached the brass plate they had mounted beside the garden, the one engraved with Summer's principle about kindness, being conserved across transformations of attention, his fingers tracing the words as if trying to feel their truth beyond their intellectual meaning. "You know what I keep thinking about," Rick said, settling onto his workbench stool with the unhurried ease he'd developed through months of practicing stillness. "I spent decades trying to outrun entropy, convinced that chaos was the universe's default state, and that the only way to survive was to be faster, smarter, more cynical than everything else." His voice carried the weight of accumulated understanding, each word placed with the precision of someone who had learned that truth required careful handling. Summer prepared their evening tea with the meditative attention that had become second nature, the kettle's gentle whistle harmonizing with the loom's steady frequency. She recognized the particular quality in Rick's voice that preceded his most vulnerable observations, understanding that this moment required the same careful tending they gave to their interdimensional plants. "I thought wonder was a luxury I couldn't afford," Rick continued, accepting the warm cup with hands that no longer trembled with urgency. "I believed gentleness was weakness disguised as virtue. But you taught me that wonder isn't optional, it's fundamental. You showed me that gentleness isn't weakness, but the universe's most sophisticated technology for creating sustainable change." Ricky reached beneath his workbench and withdrew something wrapped in soft cloth, his movements carrying the reverence he'd learned to give all precious things. When he unfolded the fabric, a small lantern no bigger than an apple blinked to life, its glass surface seeded with constellations that pulsed in rhythm with their breathing. Inside, a steady note glowed with the same pearl-colored warmth that had characterized their gentlest adventures. "I tuned it to the frequency we discovered in the lullaby dimension," Rick explained, placing the lantern between them on the workbench, where it cast dancing shadows that moved like visible music. "It remembers how to wait without drifting, how to maintain gentleness even when the world speeds up around it. If you ever feel the house losing its rhythm again, light this, and it will teach our rooms how to move at the pace of kindness." Summer felt her heart perform its familiar dance of recognition, understanding that Rick wasn't just offering her a device, but acknowledging that she had been the teacher all along, guiding him toward a peace he hadn't known he was capable of finding. The lantern's glow synchronized with the resonance loom's gentle hum, creating harmonics that filled the garage with the sound of contentment made audible. "I thought I was teaching you how to survive my universe," Rick said, his voice carrying the wonder of someone discovering that the most profound adventures weren't about conquering new territories, but about learning to inhabit familiar ones, with hearts calibrated for sustained care. "But all along you were leading me into yours, a place where intelligence serves wonder, where brilliance becomes a tool for building rather than escaping." The garage settled around them like a gentle embrace, its yellow light pulsing with the rhythm of shared understanding. Through the window, their interdimensional gardens swayed in approval, plants that existed across multiple realities bearing witness to the quiet revolution they had conducted together, one careful choice at a time. "Tomorrow," Rick said, not as a plan but as a blessing, his words carrying the weight of someone who had learned that the most important promises were the ones you made to stay present. "We'll keep practicing what we've discovered. We'll tend the garden, brew tea with water from peaceful dimensions, and remember that the universe's greatest mysteries aren't hidden in complexity, but whispered in the spaces between urgency and peace." Summer nodded with the understanding of someone who had found her purpose in teaching others to find the eye of their own storms, and together they sat in the amber sanctuary they had created. Two scientists of gentleness discovering that home wasn't just a destination, but a frequency they could tune into anywhere they chose presence over escape, patience over urgency, and the revolutionary understanding that love, properly tended, grows at exactly the pace it needs to flourish. The lantern Rick had crafted became the gentle heartbeat of their morning ritual, its pearl-colored constellations, pulsing in rhythm with the kettle's steam as Summer set out 5 cups with the natural grace of someone who had learned that invitation worked better than instruction. The device rested on the kitchen table like a small moon caught in glass, teaching the house to breathe at the pace of kindness, its frequency settling into the walls until even the refrigerator hummed in a lower, more contented key. Summer watched her family gather without summons, drawn by the warmth that had learned to speak their individual languages of comfort. Morty appeared first, his emotional radar detecting the morning's peaceful weather, followed by Beth carrying the tired smile of someone who had discovered that healing happened best when she stopped trying to fix everything with urgency. Jerry arrived with triangular sandwiches wrapped in waxed paper, their careful construction a meditation he'd learned from watching Rick's midnight rituals. "Just tea," Summer said when Morty asked if this was a lesson, though she understood it was everything they had been building toward, the moment when their quiet revolution would expand beyond the boundaries of a single household. She began with breath, not as instruction but as shared tide, teaching them the yellow light check Rick had developed in his garage, the 10 quiets that created space between stimulus and response, the gentle art of listening for what someone couldn't quite say. She passed around the device from the compliment marketplace, now tuned to family frequency, watching each of them practice the revolutionary act of speaking kindly about themselves. "My hands are steady when I make food for us," Jerry offered, his voice finding strength on the final word. Beth followed with her own discovery. "I let my patients take their time, and I'm learning to let myself take mine." Morty's contribution trembled and held. "I notice when the room gets sharp and I'm brave enough to say so." Rick didn't speak, but poured tea with focus that made silence feel like contribution, and the lantern pulsed once, as if recognizing that listening was also a form of payment to the moment itself. Summer felt something crystallizing in her chest as she watched her family practice what she had been teaching through patient example. The understanding that her purpose extended beyond this kitchen, this household, this single timeline. She thought of other families, navigating the spaces between brilliance and chaos, other granddaughters learning to translate anxiety into wisdom, other houses that had forgotten how to breathe without armor. "I've been thinking about what we've built here," Summer said, her voice carrying the quiet authority she'd developed through years of practicing gentle interruption. "About kindness as a conserved force, patience as sophisticated intelligence, wonder as fundamental rather than optional." She gestured toward the interdimensional garden visible through the window, where plants swayed in approval of conversations that moved at their own unhurried pace. Rick looked up from his tea with... The expression Summer had learned meant he was discovering new territory within himself. "You want to teach what we've learned," he said, not as question but as recognition, understanding that their quiet revolution had been preparing for this expansion all along. "Other people exist in the spaces between cosmic chaos," Summer continued, her vision emerging with the clarity of someone who had found her calling in the patient places between other people's storms. "Other families need to learn that intelligence can serve wonder instead of fear, that the most sophisticated response to complexity is sometimes just creating space for things to grow at their own pace." Beth reached across the table to touch Summer's hand briefly. Not a claim, just acknowledgement that some transformations required their own timing. "You've been practicing for this all along," she said softly, "teaching us to find our own rhythm within the chaos." The lantern pulsed with approval as the resonance loom's distant hum carried across the yard from the garage, its gentle frequency weaving their conversation into the larger symphony of sustained care they had been building. Summer understood that tomorrow would bring not just another day of practice stillness, but the beginning of something larger, a way to share their revolutionary understanding that love, properly tended, could transform not just individual hearts but the very frequency at which the universe chose to operate, one gentle choice at a time. The morning when Summer opened the garage door to find 3 strangers sitting quietly beside the interdimensional garden arrived with the gentle inevitability of seasons changing. They had traveled from dimensions where chaos moved faster than kindness, drawn by frequencies that spoke of a place where intelligence had learned to serve wonder rather than fear. Rick emerged from his workbench, no longer the manic scientist, who treated every moment as cosmic emergency, but a grandfather who recognized the particular quality of attention that preceded profound transformation. "We heard about the conservation of kindness," said the first visitor, her voice carrying the musical quality of someone who had learned to speak fluent hope, despite living in realities where gentleness required constant protection. "About a family that discovered patience was sophisticated intelligence, that the most profound adventures happened in the spaces between storms." Summer prepared tea with the meditative precision that had become second nature, understanding that this moment represented not just continuation, but expansion, their quiet revolution rippling outward through the vast network of interdimensional space. The resonance loom hummed its approval from the workbench, measuring not data but the ease that settled over the garage as strangers became guests. Guests became students of the gentle art they had been perfecting. Rick watched Summer guide the conversation with the natural authority she had developed through years of teaching others to find the eye of their own chaos. She demonstrated the pause technique as if it were music everyone already knew but had forgotten, showed them how 10 quiet breaths could create space between stimulus and response, explained how kindness followed conservation laws that made every gentle choice strengthen the field for the next act of sustained care. "The portal gun works differently now," Summer explained, lifting the device that had once been Rick's tool for frantic escape, but now pulsed with pearl-colored contentment. "Instead of running from complexity, it helps you find the frequency where your particular form of chaos can transform into sustainable peace." She opened a small gateway that revealed not another dimension, but their own back porch, viewed through eyes trained by accumulated gentleness, the same space but somehow more itself. The visitors practiced with the careful attention of people who had learned that survival sometimes required learning entirely new ways to breathe. Rick added his own observations, his voice carrying the vulnerability of someone who had discovered that the most sophisticated equations often governed the simplest truths about love and time and the courage required to let yourself be remembered for your gentleness rather than your brilliance. As afternoon light honeyed the garage's familiar amber glow, Summer opened the collection box Rick had kept since her childhood. Mason jars and mint tins filled with preserved moments of contentment, each one labeled in her developing handwriting with descriptions of captured peace. "We save the good parts," she explained, echoing words she had spoken decades ago. "Because gentle things deserve preservation, and memory grows like a garden when you tend it with the same patience you give to growing things." The visitors left, carrying small devices Summer had crafted, lanterns tuned to the lullaby dimension's frequency, compasses that pointed toward the nearest place breath could widen, resonators that helped translate anxiety into the gentle hum of understanding. Each tool pulsed with the accumulated wisdom of their quiet revolution, designed not to conquer or escape, but to help others find sustainable peace within whatever chaos they called home. That evening, as the house settled into its shared rhythm, Tove contentment and the interdimensional garden swayed in approval, Rick found Summer in the garage, working by the light of gentle inventions. Each device she built was a love letter to the grandfather who had taught her that the universe's greatest discoveries happened when you were brave enough to be still, patient enough to listen, and gentle enough to trust that wonder was fundamental, rather than optional. The portal gun hummed softly on the workbench, not with the urgency of escape, but with the contentment of someone who had learned that the most important adventures happened in the quiet moments between chaos, where love grew at the speed of understanding and wisdom tasted like sandwiches, shared at midnight under the glow of interdimensional starlight, and somewhere, in a dimension where time moves like honey and every sunset lasts exactly as long as it needs to, Rick and Summer are still sitting on that back porch, still sharing stories, still discovering that the universe's greatest mystery isn't how vast it is, but how much tenderness it can hold in the space of a single gentle moment. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.